The moment HOA Karen screamed, "You're trespassing," at my guest for stepping onto my driveway, the air on Oak Street snapped tight, the way it does right before something irreversible happens, because this wasn't a misunderstanding or a warning or even a power flex done in private. This was a public execution attempt staged in broad daylight with witnesses, phones, porches, and a clipboard held like a badge she didn't earn. She didn't ask who he was, didn't look at the coffee in his hands, didn't acknowledge that he was walking toward my front door at my invitation. She went straight to accusation, straight to control, straight to calling the police as if summoning them was the final move on a chessboard she believed she owned. I stood there barefoot in my yard, hose still dripping, roses half-watered, watching her point that pen like a weapon and announce to the street that she was about to have my guest removed, arrested, humiliated, and made an example of, all because she believed the HOA overruled reality. She was wrong, but she didn't know that yet, and that ignorance was about to cost her everything she'd built her identity on. She had that look HOA Karens get when they think they've caught someone slipping. The tight smile, the lifted chin, the clipboard pressed to her chest like it carried the weight of law, and she made sure her voice carried so every neighbor could hear her perform authority. She wanted an audience, because humiliation only counts if it's public, and she'd chosen my driveway as her stage. My guest didn't flinch, didn't raise his voice, didn't even spill the coffee. He just stopped, turned slightly, and listened, the way someone listens when they already know how this ends. That calm unsettled her, but she mistook it for compliance, and that mistake pushed her faster, louder, and harder into her role as enforcer. She dialed 911 with theatrical precision, announcing an intruder, a trespasser, a suspicious male refusing to comply, layering her words until a simple visit sounded like a threat to community safety. And with every sentence she spoke, she tightened the noose around her own authority without realizing it. Before we move forward, drop a comment. Where are you watching from? Neighbors began to emerge, first the curious, then the invested, then the ones who had their own quiet histories with her clipboard and her fines, and her warnings slipped under doors. Curtains moved, phones came out, kids stopped riding their bikes, and suddenly Oak Street wasn't a street anymore. It was a courtroom with no judge yet present. HOA Karen stood at the center, confident, rigid, absolutely certain she was about to be vindicated by flashing lights and uniforms, because in her world, calling the cops had always meant winning. She paced, narrated, gestured, built her case out loud, making sure no one missed the fact that she was in charge, that she had escalated, that she had decided this man didn't belong, and therefore didn't deserve dignity. I watched her do it, felt the familiar tightening in my chest that comes when you recognize abuse, wearing the costume of procedure, and I knew this wasn't about my guest anymore. This was about power being challenged by its own excess. When the sirens started in the distance, her confidence swelled visibly, shoulders squaring, mouth curling into something that looked like satisfaction, because she believed the arrival of law enforcement would lock the narrative in her favor. She didn't know that the man she'd labeled an intruder had trained half the deputies in this county, that the badge she worshipped from a distance answered directly to him, that the authority she pretended to wield was about to collide head-on with the real thing. She didn't know that every word she'd spoken into that phone was recorded, that every accusation would soon be replayed in a context she never anticipated, that every neighbor watching would leave this moment seeing her differently forever. All she knew was that she'd called the cops, and in her experience, that meant the end of the story. The patrol cars rolled in with practiced precision, red and blue washing over lawns and faces, and HOA Karen stepped forward like a victorious plaintiff, clipboard raised, already speaking before the doors fully opened. She launched into her report without pause, pointing, listing violations, framing herself as the guardian of order, never once stopping to read the room, never noticing the subtle change in posture from the deputy who'd just stepped out. That deputy didn't look at her first. He looked at my guest, and in that fraction of a second, recognition settled in. The shift was almost imperceptible, but to anyone who understands authority, it was seismic. His shoulders straightened, his expression sharpened, and the noise of the street seemed to dull as training took over. What happened next didn't just end her power trip, it erased it. The deputy stopped 6 feet from the man she'd accused, brought his heels together with ceremonial precision, and raised his hand in a salute so crisp it cut through the morning air. He addressed my guest by title, by name, by rank, his voice steady and respectful, loud enough for every witness to hear. The effect on HOA Karen was immediate and devastating. Her clipboard slipped from her fingers and hit the concrete with a sound that felt final, like a gavel striking once with no appeal allowed. The color drained from her face, her mouth opened without sound, and the authority she'd been performing collapsed in real time under the weight of a single gesture she hadn't earned. The street reacted in waves, gasps first, then whispers, then the rapid spread of understanding as neighbors connected the dots and realized exactly what she'd done. She hadn't just called the police on an invited guest. She'd tried to weaponize law enforcement against the highest-ranking officer in the county, in public, on a Sunday morning, over coffee. The deputy held the salute for a beat longer than necessary, not out of cruelty, but out of protocol. And that extra second stretched her humiliation into something unforgettable. She stood frozen, exposed, stripped of narrative control, while the reality she'd ignored took center stage. My guest acknowledged the salute calmly, professionally, the way real authority always does. And in that moment, the entire balance of Oak Street shifted. The deputies apologized for the confusion. The crowd murmured. Phones kept recording. And HOA Karen retreated backward without a single word to defend herself. She had nothing left to say, because every rule she'd quoted, every threat she'd made, every fine she'd issued suddenly existed in the shadow of a system she didn't command and never truly understood. This wasn't a shouting match. It wasn't a lecture. It wasn't even revenge. It was a quiet, surgical collapse of false power, exposed by the presence of the real thing. The deputy's salute didn't just end a confrontation, it rewrote the social order of the block, and as HOA Karen stood there gathering her fallen clipboard like debris after a storm, it was clear this moment wouldn't stay contained to my driveway. The people watching had seen something important, something rare, the exact point where intimidation fails because it finally meets resistance that doesn't need to raise its voice. The shock wasn't just hers. It belonged to every neighbor who had ever paid a fine out of fear, every homeowner who had ever complied because it was easier than fighting, every person who thought the clipboard was untouchable. That belief died right there on the concrete, and nothing that came after would be able to bring it back. Authority isn't something you announce, it's something you carry, and I'd spent most of my adult life learning that the hard way in rooms far more dangerous than a suburban street. 20 years as a detective had trained my instincts to read tone before words, posture before threats, and silence before violence, which is why when HOA Karen started her performance that morning, I didn't step in immediately. I'd seen this type before, not criminals exactly, but people addicted to control, people who mistook procedure for power and noise for legitimacy, people who believed that if they sounded official enough, reality would bend to accommodate them. I had retired 3 months earlier, traded late nights and interrogation rooms for quiet mornings and gardening, but retirement doesn't strip away awareness. It just gives you the space to notice things others miss. When Karen marched across my driveway with that clipboard and that voice, I recognized the posture instantly, not as authority, but as someone desperately pretending to have it. My guest that morning wasn't just an old friend. He was someone I'd trained from the ground up. Someone I'd watched evolve from a rookie with good instincts into a professional who understood restraint better than most people understand force. I knew exactly how he'd respond to provocation, not because he was passive, but because he was disciplined. Real authority doesn't rush, it waits, and I trusted him to handle himself even before the sirens arrived. What HOA Karen didn't know, and what she never bothered to find out, was that she was confronting 2 men who had spent decades operating under actual law, actual consequences, and actual accountability. To her, we were just bodies in a space she believed she owned. To us, she was a variable, loud, predictable, and dangerously overconfident. The neighborhood itself had a history with her long before that morning. even if most of it was whispered instead of spoken. Fines slipped into mailboxes without warning, notices taped to doors for violations no one remembered agreeing to, emails sent in bold red text about community standards that seemed to change depending on who she was targeting. People complied, not because they believed in her rules, but because resistance required energy, money, and time, and she had made it clear she was willing to drain all three. That's how false authority survives. Not through legitimacy, but through exhaustion. Over time, neighbors stopped questioning, stopped pushing back, stopped comparing notes. And that silence fed her confidence until she believed her interpretation of the HOA bylaws outranked common sense. I had moved into the neighborhood quietly, intentionally, because after years of being known professionally, anonymity felt like a luxury. I didn't advertise my past, didn't introduce myself as a retired detective, didn't correct assumptions when people mistook me for just another older guy enjoying retirement. Authority that needs to be announced is already weak, and I'd learned long ago that the most effective presence is the one that doesn't demand attention. HOA Karen saw that quiet as an opening, as weakness, as an invitation to establish dominance early, and that miscalculation shaped everything that followed. She assumed I'd fall in line like others had, that I'd apologize, comply, maybe even thank her for enforcing order, because that was the pattern she was used to. What she didn't understand was that my relationship to authority had never been about obedience. It had been about responsibility. I'd spent years answering to internal affairs, judges, prosecutors, and the public, learning exactly where my power began and where it ended, learning the cost of crossing those lines. The idea that a private HOA could unilaterally declare someone a trespasser on private property without evidence, without context, and without jurisdiction wasn't just absurd to me, it was dangerous. That kind of thinking blurs lines that exist for a reason, and people who blur those lines tend to escalate until they're stopped by something they can't intimidate. My guest understood that too, which is why he didn't identify himself immediately when she demanded it, not out of arrogance, but out of principle. Law enforcement officers aren't required to present credentials to private citizens making baseless demands, especially when they are off-duty and lawfully present as invited guests. Karen's assumption that she could compel compliance simply by insisting on it revealed everything about her understanding of authority, which was to say she had none. She relied on the performance of power, the aesthetics of enforcement, the clipboard, the jargon, the threat of escalation, because she had never been tested by someone who knew the difference. As neighbors gathered and the situation grew more public, the dynamic shifted in subtle ways she didn't notice. People who had once nodded along to her complaints started watching instead of agreeing. Phones came out not to support her narrative, but to document it. The same community she believed she controlled was now observing her without fear, and that alone was destabilizing. Authority thrives on isolation, on keeping targets separated and uncertain, and the moment this became a shared experience, her leverage began to erode. She compensated the only way she knew how, by escalating, by calling 911, by invoking a higher power she believed would reinforce her position. That call revealed another critical misunderstanding on her part, the belief that law enforcement exists to enforce her comfort rather than the law. She spoke to the dispatcher in absolutes, labeled my guest a threat, implied criminal intent where none existed because in her mind, exaggeration was justified if it produced compliance. What she didn't account for was the paper trail she was creating, the recording she was authoring, the permanent record of her own misrepresentation. People who abuse systems forget that those systems document everything, and documentation has a way of resurfacing when you least expect it. By the time the patrol cars arrived, the hierarchy of authority was already in place, even if only a few of us recognized it. The deputies weren't there to validate her. They were there to assess a situation impartially, and the moment they saw my guest's demeanor, his posture, his calm, the narrative she'd built began to crack. Real authority recognizes itself instinctively, and that recognition doesn't require explanation. The salute that followed wasn't dramatic for its own sake. It was procedural, automatic. the result of training and respect intersecting in a public space that had never seen it before. That salute didn't elevate my guest. It revealed him, and in doing so, it exposed the emptiness of HOA Karen's performance. Authority backed by law doesn't need to threaten, doesn't need to shout, doesn't need to call for reinforcements to feel real. It stands, it waits, and when necessary it acts with precision. The contrast between that and Karen's frantic grasping was impossible to ignore, and the people watching understood it immediately, even if they couldn't articulate it yet. They had just witnessed the difference between power borrowed and power earned. From that moment on, the story stopped being about a trespassing accusation and became about legitimacy, about who gets to decide what rules matter and why. Karen's authority had always depended on people not knowing better, not asking questions, not comparing notes, and in one unplanned morning, that ignorance evaporated. My background, my guest's position, the deputy's salute, they all converged into a single undeniable truth that rippled through the block. HOA. Karen wasn't in charge because she never had been. She had just been loud in a vacuum, and the vacuum was gone. HOA Karen's authority had never been organic. It was engineered, assembled piece by piece through selective enforcement, procedural intimidation, and a careful manipulation of apathy. She didn't seize power in a dramatic takeover. She accumulated it quietly, exploiting the fact that most people just wanted to live their lives without conflict. The HOA structure gave her the perfect framework, a set of vaguely worded bylaws, minimal oversight, and a rotating cast of board members who either deferred to her out of convenience or quietly resigned once they realized how much resistance would cost them. Over time, the board stopped functioning as a collective and became a rubber stamp, with Karen setting agendas, interpreting rules, and deciding consequences without challenge. What looked like community governance on paper was, in practice, a centralized control system driven by one person's obsession with dominance. She mastered the art of selective pressure, rarely going after everyone at once, instead isolating individuals one by one. A warning letter here, a fine there, always just small enough to seem not worth fighting, but frequent enough to create a constant low-level stress that kept people compliant. If someone pushed back, the response escalated, violations multiplied, deadlines shortened, and suddenly a simple disagreement turned into a financial and emotional drain. Most residents learned quickly that peace was cheaper than resistance, and that lesson spread faster than any official communication. Fear doesn't need to be loud when it's consistent, and Karen understood that instinctively. The most effective part of her system was ambiguity. Rules were enforced inconsistently by design, which meant no one could predict when they might become a target. A basketball hoop that was fine for one house became a violation for another. A guest parked overnight without issue on one street triggered warnings on the next. This inconsistency wasn't incompetence, it was leverage. When rules are unclear, authority shifts to the interpreter, and Karen positioned herself as the sole interpreter of what was acceptable. Residents stopped asking what the rules said and started asking what Karen would allow, and that shift was the foundation of her power. Documentation became her weapon of choice. Everything was written, logged, dated, and framed in official language that mimicked municipal authority. Emails referenced sections and subsections. Notices were formatted to resemble legal filings, and conversations were always followed by written summaries that reflected her version of events. She understood that paper trails intimidate people, especially when they don't know which documents actually carry legal weight. The average homeowner doesn't want to research statutes or challenge administrative language. They want the problem to go away, and Karen exploited that instinct relentlessly. Social pressure played an equally important role. She cultivated allies, exemptions, offering favors, or simply leaving certain households alone, creating an unspoken hierarchy within the neighborhood. Those who benefited from her discretion had a vested interest in maintaining her control, while those targeted felt isolated and unsure of who would support them if they spoke up. Over time, this fractured the community. turning neighbors into spectators instead of participants. People watched violations happen to others and stayed silent, convincing themselves it wasn't their problem, not realizing that silence was exactly what sustained the system. Her misuse of emergency services was the natural extension of this mindset. Once someone believes their authority is absolute within a defined space, escalation feels justified, even necessary. Calling the police wasn't a last resort for Karen. It was a performance tool, a way to dramatize her power and reinforce the idea that resistance would bring consequences far beyond an HOA fine. Each call reinforced her self-image as the gatekeeper of safety, even when the situations she reported were trivial or manufactured. The fact that most calls didn't result in arrests didn't matter to her, because the disruption itself was the punishment. What Karen failed to understand, every abuse of power leaves evidence, and patterns are visible to those trained to look for them. False reports, retaliatory complaints, inconsistent enforcement, these aren't isolated incidents. They form a recognizable signature. Law enforcement, legal professionals, and even informed residents can trace that signature back to its source, especially when the person wielding authority lacks restraint. Karen's confidence blinded her to the cumulative weight of her actions. The way each escalation added another layer to a record that could eventually be examined in full. By the time she confronted my guest in the driveway, her system was already brittle, held together by habit rather than legitimacy. The community's compliance wasn't loyalty. It was fatigue, and fatigue evaporates quickly when people witness a clear example of overreach. That morning didn't create her downfall. It exposed it. The power structure she had built depended entirely on the assumption that no one involved understood real authority well enough to challenge her interpretation of it. The moment that assumption failed, the entire structure began to collapse under its own weight, revealing an organization that had never been about community standards at all, only about control. Once the salute landed and the initial shock rippled through the street, the moment stopped being emotional and started becoming evidentiary. That shift is where real consequences are born, not in outrage or embarrassment, but in documentation, timelines, and corroboration. HOA. Karen had always relied on the belief that no one would ever line up her behavior side by side and examine it as a whole. Her power existed in fragments, isolated incidents that felt too small on their own to justify escalation. What she never accounted for was what happens when those fragments are gathered, ordered, and examined by people trained to recognize patterns of abuse rather than isolated complaints. The deputies didn't raise their voices or threaten her. They did something far more damaging. They started asking questions. Simple questions. Procedural questions. The kind that force clarity where ambiguity once lived. Who invited the guest? How long had he been there? What specific statute was being violated? And what authority, she believed, allowed her to classify someone as a trespasser on private property? Each question narrowed the narrative, stripping away her ability to grandstand and forcing her to articulate legal justifications she had never actually possessed. Her answers, once confident, began to circle themselves, repeating HOA language that carried no statutory weight. At the same time, neighbors who had remained silent for months started speaking, not emotionally, but factually. They pointed out that guests had parked on that street countless times without issue. They referenced past incidents where Karen had threatened enforcement that never materialized. Phones that had come out for spectacle were now recording for preservation, capturing not just her words, but the reactions of law enforcement correcting her assumptions in real time. The crowd stopped being an audience and became witnesses, and witnesses change everything. The 911 call itself became the first hard piece of proof. Dispatch logs don't lie, recordings don't reinterpret themselves, and the language Karen used to describe the situation revealed intent rather than concern. She hadn't reported a disturbance. She had framed a narrative of criminality where none existed, escalating language deliberately to provoke a response. For someone accustomed to filing complaints, this was a dangerous habit, because intent matters, and misrepresentation to emergency services carries consequences far beyond HOA politics. What she believed was a show of authority was now preserved as evidence of misuse. As deputies reviewed the call details on their in-car systems, the tone shifted further. This was no longer a neighbor dispute. It was a false report intersecting with a pattern of behavior. When asked whether she had previously contacted law enforcement for similar issues, Karen hesitated, and that hesitation spoke louder than any argument she could have made. Records don't rely on memory, and within minutes, a partial history was visible, enough to suggest repetition rather than anomaly. Each prior call, dismissed or resolved without action, added weight to the conclusion that this was not about safety. Documentation began to surface from residents as well. Screenshots of emails, copies of violation notices, timestamps showing how quickly enforcement escalated after disagreements. Individually, each document looked minor, but together, they formed a clear progression. Warning, fine, threat, escalation. This wasn't enforcement, it was conditioning. The discovery phase didn't require a formal investigation yet. It unfolded organically as people realized that the same tactics used on them were now on public display. Shared experience transformed private frustration into collective clarity. What made the situation irreversible was the involvement of legitimate authority correcting false authority in front of witnesses. When a deputy calmly explained that an HOA does not have the power to declare criminal trespass without property owner consent and law enforcement verification, that explanation wasn't just for Karen, it was for everyone listening. It dismantled years of assumption in a single sentence. People who had paid fines out of fear suddenly understood that the compliance had been voluntary, not mandatory, and that realization carried a sense of betrayal, deeper than anger. Karen attempted to reassert control by referencing bylaws and security policies, but each reference was met with a request for statutory backing she could not provide. Bylaws govern associations, not criminal law, and the distinction became painfully clear as deputies explained jurisdiction in plain language. Every correction chipped away at her constructed identity, exposing the gap between what she claimed and what was real. The clipboard that once symbolized order now looked like a prop, and props lose power once the audience understands the script. The proof wasn't just legal, it was behavioral. Her inability to de-escalate, her insistence on punishment over resolution, her immediate reach for enforcement rather than dialogue, all of it painted a picture of someone more interested in dominance than safety. Law enforcement professionals recognize that pattern because it mirrors the behavior of individuals who provoke conflict to justify control. The difference here was that the pattern was unfolding in daylight, recorded, witnessed, and contextualized. As the deputies concluded their on-scene assessment, they did not issue citations or make arrests because there was no crime. That absence became its own form of proof. No trespass, no threat, no violation, just an unfounded accusation. Karen was informed, calmly and clearly, that further misuse of emergency services could carry consequences, and that HOA authority does not supersede private property rights. The warning was procedural, but its implications were devastating. Her ultimate weapon had been neutralized by clarity. The neighborhood absorbed this in stages. Some people looked embarrassed, others relieved, others quietly furious at themselves for having believed her for so long. Proof doesn't always feel like vindication. Sometimes it feels like loss, the loss of an illusion that once felt safer than uncertainty. But illusions built on fear don't deserve preservation. And that understanding settled in as the deputies departed, leaving behind a community changed by information rather than force. In the aftermath, the evidence continued to accumulate. Residents compared notes, timelines aligned, and what had once been dismissed as personal disputes revealed themselves as a coordinated pattern of intimidation. The discovery phase didn't end in that driveway. It began there. Every document saved, every recording shared, every story corroborated added depth to the truth that had been exposed. HOA Karen's authority had depended on people never reaching this point, never connecting these dots, never realizing that proof doesn't require permission to exist. By the end of that day, her power was no longer theoretical, it was measurable, and measurement is the enemy of unchecked control. What had started as a baseless trespassing report had turned into a documented example of systemic overreach, witnessed by law enforcement, recorded by residents, and grounded in clear legal explanation. Proof doesn't shout, it sits patiently, waiting for someone to look at it honestly, and once it's seen, it cannot be unseen. The confrontation did not arrive with shouting or sudden movement, it arrived with attention, and that was far more destructive to HOA Karen than any argument could have been. Once the deputies clarified their role and the neighbors understood what they were witnessing, the emotional gravity shifted entirely. Karen was no longer directing the scene. She was trapped inside it, exposed under the collective gaze of the very people she had spent years managing through intimidation. Public collapse doesn't happen when someone is contradicted. It happens when their authority evaporates in front of witnesses who now understand they never needed to obey. Karen tried to reclaim the moment by escalating her tone, raising her voice just enough to suggest confidence without tipping fully into hysteria. She repeated her title, referenced her position, and gestured to her clipboard as if repetition alone could restore legitimacy. But repetition without substance sounds hollow, once an audience has learned the difference between rules and law. Each time she spoke, she was answered not with fear, but with calm correction, and calm is devastating to someone whose power depends on emotional dominance. The deputy's posture never changed. That stillness became the focal point of the street, a physical demonstration of where real authority resides. When Karen demanded action, she was met with explanation. When she insisted on enforcement, she was met with jurisdiction. The contrast was unmistakable. One side relied on volume and assertion, the other relied on procedure and clarity. Neighbors began shifting their weight, murmuring quietly, not in support of Karen, but in recognition of how far she had overstepped. Her collapse accelerated when the deputies addressed the crowd rather than her. That redirection stripped her of the central role she had always claimed. They explained, in plain language, what an HOA can and cannot do, how trespassing actually works, and why a property owner's consent matters. Each sentence dismantled a layer of assumption the neighborhood had carried for years. Karen wasn't just wrong in this instance, she had been wrong structurally, and the realization landed heavily. The moment that broke her composure was not the correction, it was the reaction of the neighbors. Faces that once avoided her now watched openly. People who had complied silently were no longer looking away. Some crossed their arms, others shook their heads, and a few spoke up, calmly referencing past incidents that now made sense in context. These were not accusations, they were confirmations, and confirmations are impossible to deflect without accountability. Karen attempted to reframe the situation as persecution, suggesting that she was being undermined for doing her job. That argument collapsed instantly because her job, as it turned out, did not include criminal classification, police direction, or emergency escalation. When one of the deputies clarified that misuse of emergency services could itself constitute a violation, the color drained from her face. The power dynamic inverted completely. The threat she had relied on was now pointed back at her, not aggressively, but factually. Her clipboard slipped slightly in her grip, a small physical detail that carried symbolic weight. That object had once represented certainty, but now it looked like a shield made of paper. She glanced around as if searching for support, but found none. Even those who had benefited from her discretion remained silent, unwilling to attach themselves to a collapsing authority. Silence, which had once protected her, now isolated her. The public nature of the collapse mattered. This wasn't a private reprimand or a quiet correction. It unfolded in front of the community she had controlled. Every neighbor present absorbed the same lesson simultaneously, and shared realization is powerful. Karen's control had depended on fragmented understanding, each person believing they were alone in their frustration. The confrontation unified that understanding, turning individual doubt into collective clarity. As the deputies concluded their interaction, They did not lecture her or threaten immediate consequences. They didn't need to. The damage was already done. They informed her that the matter was resolved, that no crime had occurred, and that further action would not be taken at this time. That restraint was the final blow. Without punishment to dramatize, Karen was left standing in the aftermath of her own exposure, stripped of narrative control and audience sympathy. She gathered her clipboard slowly, her movements rigid and deliberate, and retreated without another word. No one stopped her. No one followed. The crowd didn't cheer or clap, because victory of this kind doesn't invite celebration. It invites release. People exhaled, conversations resumed quietly, and the street began returning to its normal rhythm. But something fundamental had changed. The confrontation ended not with her defeat being declared, but with her irrelevance becoming obvious. Power trips end when the audience stops believing in them, and that morning, belief dissolved in real time. HOA Karen walked away with her authority publicly dismantled, her methods exposed, and her image permanently altered into the eyes of the people she once ruled. The collapse was complete, not because she was shouted down, but because she was understood. The retaliation did not come from anger or impulse, it came from expertise, and that distinction mattered more than anything Karen had anticipated. She had spent years escalating conflicts under the assumption that anyone who opposed her would either burn out or overreact, giving her justification to escalate further. What she had never faced before was a response that was patient, methodical, and grounded entirely in systems she did not control. This was not personal retaliation, it was professional correction, and it unfolded in ways that left no room for theatrics or deflection. The first shift happened quietly, almost invisibly. Communications began changing tone. Where Karen had once dominated email threads with authoritative language and deadline pressure, responses now came from residents citing statutes, precedents, and jurisdictional limits. Questions replaced compliance. Requests for clarification replaced immediate payment. The power dynamic changed not because people became confrontational, but because they became informed. Expertise has a way of flattening intimidation, and Karen's tactics relied on ignorance more than obedience. Legal expertise entered the picture next, not through lawsuits or threats, but through presence. One resident consulted an attorney about a prior fine and shared the response publicly. Another referenced state HOA regulations during a meeting, reading directly from the statute rather than paraphrasing bylaws. Each citation acted like a small, controlled detonation, removing another patch of ground Karen had stood on. She was no longer arguing with emotions or opinions. She was being countered with facts she could not reinterpret. Law enforcement expertise continued to apply pressure without ever needing to return physically. The deputies' explanation that morning did not vanish when they left. It echoed. Residents understood now what constituted a legitimate call and what did not. Karen's most effective weapon had been the implied threat of police involvement, and once that threat was revealed as hollow, it lost all utility. She could still make calls, but she could no longer control how they would be interpreted, and that uncertainty made escalation risky rather than empowering. Administrative expertise followed. HOA board members who had previously deferred began asking procedural questions, requesting votes, and insisting on documentation that matched actual authority. Agendas were challenged, motions slowed, and decisions subjected to review. Karen's efficiency, once praised as leadership, was exposed as unilateral control. Process replaced personality, and process does not bend to intimidation. Each meeting became less about enforcement and more about governance, a transition she could not navigate without relinquishing dominance. What made the retaliation irreversible was that it never targeted her directly. No one insulted her, no one confronted her emotionally, and no one sought revenge. Instead, they corrected systems. They filed records requests. They demanded transparency. They asked for oversight. These actions did not escalate conflict, they neutralized it. Karen had built her authority on speed and surprise, and expertise slowed everything down to a pace she could not manipulate. Her responses became increasingly strained. Emails grew longer, more defensive, packed with justifications that no one had asked for. She cited rules that no longer impressed, referenced authority that no longer went unquestioned, and warned of consequences that now carried little weight. Each attempt to reassert control revealed how much control she had already lost. Expertise doesn't need to announce itself. It simply outlasts intimidation. The community's tone shifted as well. Conversations that once happened in whispers moved into open discussion. Residents compared experiences, not with outrage, but with analysis. Patterns were identified, timelines aligned, and decisions contextualized. Karen's actions were no longer isolated incidents. They were data points. And once behavior becomes data, it can be evaluated, challenged, and corrected without emotion. Karen attempted to frame this pushback as harassment against her, but that narrative collapsed quickly. Retaliation implies emotion, and what she faced was structural response. No one was targeting her personally. They were removing the mechanisms she had abused. That distinction left her without a defense, because systems do not have motives. They have functions, and the function of expertise is to restore balance. By the time she realized what was happening, it was already too late to reverse. Authority had migrated away from her, redistributed through clarity, knowledge, and shared understanding. She could still speak, but her words no longer carried consequence. She could still cite rules, but no one accepted her interpretation without verification. The retaliation was complete, not because she was punished, but because she was contained. Expert retaliation doesn't look like vengeance. It looks like inevitability. It doesn't humiliate publicly. It dismantles quietly. Karen's power trip did not end with the dramatic takedown. It ended with her becoming just another participant in a system she once dominated. And for someone who built their identity on control, that loss was far more devastating than any fine or reprimand could ever be. The victory did not announce itself with applause, policy statements, or formal declarations. It arrived quietly, in the absence of disruption, in the sudden ease with which life resumed once HOA Karen's influence dissolved. Power that is removed rather than transferred leaves no successor, only space, and that space was filled almost immediately by normalcy. No one waited for permission to move on. They simply did. Mornings returned to routine without commentary. Guests came and went without being logged, questioned, or scrutinized. Cars parked overnight without warning notices tucked under wipers. Conversations happened on driveways without anyone scanning for enforcement. These details mattered more than any formal outcome, because they signaled that fear was gone. The neighborhood did not celebrate Karen's loss of authority. It forgot to account for her at all. And irrelevance is the coldest form of defeat. Karen herself did not vanish, but she ceased to matter. She attended meetings less frequently, and when she did, her presence no longer redirected the room. Questions were answered without looking to her. Decisions were made without deferring to her interpretation. She spoke occasionally, but her words landed flat, received as opinion rather than instruction. The clipboard was still there, but it no longer commanded attention. It was just paper in her hands, stripped of the weight she once forced others to assign to it. There was no final confrontation, no dramatic removal, because those would have granted her the significance she craved. Instead, the system corrected itself around her. Processes replaced personality. Transparency replaced discretion. Oversight replaced assumption. The tools she once used to dominate became the very mechanisms that constrained her, and that inversion required no emotional investment from anyone involved. What lingered was the understanding the community now shared. People knew the limits of HOA authority. They understood the difference between private rules and public law. They recognized intimidation when they saw it, and no longer mistook confidence for legitimacy. That knowledge did not fade, because it was earned through experience rather than instruction. Karen's actions had taught them more effectively than any handbook ever could. The narrator's life returned to its quiet rhythm without reflection or commentary. There was no need to process the event publicly or extract meaning from it. Justice had been served not through punishment, but through correction. The situation resolved itself the way it should have from the beginning, through clarity, restraint, and the quiet enforcement of real boundaries. Weeks passed without incident, No emergency calls, no violation letters, no manufactured crises. The absence of conflict became so complete that it was no longer remarked upon. The neighborhood did not become perfect, it became ordinary, and that ordinariness was the reward. Karen's control had fed on disruption, and without it, there was nothing left for her to grasp. The story ended the way power trips always do when exposed, not with redemption, not with lessons, but with silence. No one argued, no one followed up, no one checked to see if she was watching. HOA Karen went silent.